But as they head deeper into the darkness, they make an unexpected discovery. They find more than 40 human skeletons, some of which are abnormally large.
For 60 years, the bones sat in a drawer in Copenhagen. Nobody knew what they were holding. The DNA inside them has now rewritten the founding story of 2 continents, revealing a population that every textbook said was never there. They lived in Ice Age Alaska for thousands of years, on the edge of a country now underwater.
Subsequently, archaeologists entered the area, and through the late 70s, they dug and they found over 5,000 fragments.
Then they vanished, leaving only a genetic signature buried in 14,000-year-old remains, and a discovery that is breaking everything we thought we knew. The camp that shouldn't exist. In 1991, archaeologist Charles Holmes first identified Swan Point as significant. But it wasn't until Ben Potter of the University of Alaska, Fairbanks led systematic excavations between 2006 and 2013, that the site's full importance became undeniable. What Potter's team found at the deepest cultural layer, Component 4, stopped them cold. Microblades, hearths, animal bones, deliberately arranged. Not scattered debris from a lost traveler, a residential camp, a place people return to repeatedly, seasonally, intentionally. The radiocarbon dates on that lowest layer came back at approximately 14,000 years before present, placing humans in interior Alaska at the very end of the Pleistocene, when the Bering Land Bridge was still solid ground beneath people's feet. The microblades themselves told a deeper story. These weren't random stone flakes. They were precision-manufactured tools, tiny, razor-sharp blades struck from carefully prepared cores, identical in technique to tools found in Northeast Asia and Siberia from the same period. Potter published his findings in the journal Paleo-America in 2017, stating directly, "Swan Point represents some of the earliest well-documented human occupation in eastern Beringia. The faunal remains recovered alongside those tools included wapiti, bison, and mammoth, Ice Age megafauna that no longer exist in Alaska. These weren't people scraping by. They were skilled hunters operating in one of Earth's harshest environments with sophisticated technology. Here's what breaks the old textbook model. Swan Point's 14,000-year-old occupation layer predates Clovis, the supposedly first American culture, by at least 1,000 years, and it sits in Alaska, not the American Southwest where Clovis points were found. The people at Swan Point weren't arriving in America. They were already home in it, which immediately raises the question that kept archaeologists awake at night. If they were already established in Alaska 14,000 years ago, who exactly were they? The bones were about to answer that. But the answer nobody predicted was hiding not in Alaska, but in a museum drawer in Copenhagen. The baby who rewrote 2 continents. Connemara River Valley, interior Alaska, June 2013. Ben Potter's team was excavating a site called Upward Sun River, Izasana in the local Athabascan language, when they hit something unexpected beneath a layer of burned earth. 2 infants, buried together, undisturbed. The burial pit was lined with red ochre, an iron-rich pigment used ritually across cultures worldwide. Beside the children lay carefully placed hunting tools, antler rods, dart points, and a biface knife. Whoever buried these children did not abandon them. They grieved them. They equipped them for something beyond death. Radiocarbon dating placed the burial at 11,500 years before present. One infant, designated USR1, was a female, likely 6 to 12 weeks old at death. The preservation of her remains was exceptional enough that ancient DNA laboratories could attempt full genome sequencing. The sample went to a team led by Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, the same scientist who had pioneered ancient DNA recovery from permafrost specimens. His team spent years refining the genome before publishing in Nature on January 3, 2018. The title was understated. The findings were not. USR1 belonged to a population nobody knew existed. Her genome showed a lineage that had diverged from all other Native Americans approximately 20,000 years ago, before any migration south had begun, and then remained completely isolated in Beringia for thousands of years. She was not ancestral to most modern Native Americans. She was a parallel branch, a sister lineage that split early, stayed north, and then vanished. Villerslev's team named them the Ancient Beringians. Co-author J. Victor Moreno-Mayer stated in the paper, "The ancient Beringian population diverged from the ancestors of other Native Americans before the latter dispersed southward." Think about what that means structurally. Every textbook diagram showed one founding population entering the Americas. USR1's genome proved there were at minimum two, and one of them never made it into any textbook because nobody knew they existed. They lived in Alaska. They built fires. They buried their children with ochre and weapons. Then they disappeared from the genetic record entirely. No confirmed modern descendants, no living community that carries their lineage in full. Footprints frozen in time, while the Ice Age was still happening. In the same desert where the US government once tested nuclear weapons, a team of scientists found something that detonated the entire timeline of American prehistory. Human footprints, dozens of them, pressed into the muddy shoreline of an ancient lake called Lake Otero, now dried to a salt flat, and then sealed under sediment for thousands of years. The prints were unmistakable. Adult tracks, child tracks. One remarkable sequence showed a large adult carrying a toddler, setting the child down, walking forward, then returning. The toddler's footprints appearing briefly, then disappearing again as the adult picked them back up. Archaeologist Matthew Bennett of Bournemouth University led the analysis. Published in Science on September 23, 2021. The radiocarbon dates from aquatic grass seeds embedded directly in the footprint layers came back at 21,000 to 23,000 years before present. The scientific community erupted. That date placed humans in the interior of North America at the absolute peak of the last glacial maximum, the coldest, most brutal phase of the last ice age, when the Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada in ice up to 2 miles thick, and when, according to every existing model, nobody was supposed to be south of that ice yet. Critics immediately challenged the dates. Aquatic plants are known to absorb old carbon dissolved in groundwater, which can make radiocarbon dates read artificially old, a well-documented problem called the reservoir effect. It was a legitimate objection, so Bennett's team went back. In 2023, publishing again in Science, they returned with 3 entirely independent dating methods. Optically stimulated, luminescence on sand grains above and below the prints, radiocarbon dating of conifer pollen. A land-based plant with no reservoir problem, uranium-thorium, dating of carbonate layers. All 3 methods agreed. The prints dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. Lead researcher Kathleen Springer of the U.S. Geological Survey stated bluntly, "The evidence is robust. These dates are real. Here is what makes this genuinely staggering. The ice-free corridor through Canada, the traditional highway for the first Americans, did not open until approximately 13,000 years ago. The coastal kelp highway route along the Pacific Northwest may have been accessible slightly earlier, but most models place that at 16,000 years ago at the earliest. White Sands sits thousands of miles south of Alaska, in present-day New Mexico, at a time when neither route into the continent was fully available, which means whoever made those footprints either used a route we haven't identified yet, arrived far earlier than the genetics currently accounts for, or belonged to a population that left no clear modern descendants. Another ghost lineage, walking barefoot through an Ice Age desert, completely erased from every living genome on Earth. The footprints themselves offer one final haunting detail. They are not the tracks of people passing through. Researchers identified at least 61 individual track sites across the White Sands landscape, multiple ages, multiple body sizes, people who returned repeatedly to the same lakeshore over a period of roughly 2,000 years. The question those footprints leave behind is the most unsettling one in American archaeology right now. Where did they come from? And where did they go? The continent swallowed by the sea. Bering Sea, present day, 180 feet underwater. Right now, sitting beneath one of the most violent and inaccessible stretches of ocean on Earth are the campsites, hearths, burial grounds, and migration routes of the people who started everything discussed above. Not metaphorically, literally. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, global sea levels were approximately 120 to 130 meters lower than today. The shallow continental shelf between Siberia and Alaska was completely exposed. What emerged was a landmass that geologists call Beringia, stretching 1,000 miles from north to south at its widest point, covering roughly 1.6 million square kilometers. Nearly the size of Australia, not tundra wasteland, not a frozen bridge, a functioning ecosystem. Paleoecologist Scott Elias of Royal Holloway, University of London, spent years analyzing insect fossils, specifically beetles, extracted from Beringian sediment cores. Beetles are extraordinarily sensitive environmental indicators. Different species require specific temperature ranges, moisture levels, and vegetation types to survive. What Elias found, published across multiple studies, including a landmark paper in Quaternary Science Reviews in 2000, was that central Beringia maintained mean July temperatures of approximately 7 to 12 degrees Celsius during the glacial period. Cold, but survivable. The region supported mammoth steppe grassland, a productive ecosystem of grasses, sedges, and flowering plants that sustained mammoth, bison, woolly rhinoceros, cave lion, and horse in enormous numbers. This was not a corridor people sprinted across. Geneticist John Hoffaker of the University of Colorado, writing in Science in 2014 alongside Scott Elias, calculated that the founding population of the Americas likely sheltered in Beringia for between 8,000 and 15,000 years before dispersing southward, a period now called the Beringian Standstill, 8,000 years minimum. For context, 8,000 years ago, humans in the Middle East were just beginning to build the first cities. The entire span of recorded human civilization, Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the modern world, fits inside that waiting period. Entire generations were born, lived full lives, and died in a country that no longer exists above water. And almost none of their archaeological records survived the flooding. When the glaciers began melting around 19,000 years ago, sea levels rose with terrifying geological speed. By 11,000 years ago, the Bering land bridge was completely submerged. The flooding happened at an average rate of roughly 1 centimeter per year. Slow by human standards, catastrophic by archaeological ones. Every campsite on the Beringian coast slipped underwater. Every kill site on the southern shoreline. Every location where the first Americans buried their dead, cached their tools, or gathered seasonally, gone. Sealed under 180 feet of cold, dark, sediment-laden water. Oceanographer Brendan Riley of Oregon State University, working with sediment cores pulled from the Bering Sea floor in 2021, confirmed that the submerged Beringian landscape is not destroyed. It is preserved. Buried under meters of marine sediment, the original terrestrial surface remains largely intact. Organic material is down there. Potentially, archaeological material is too, but retrieving it is nearly impossible. The Bering Sea averages 200-meter depths across much of the submerged shelf. Surface conditions include hurricane-force storms for up to 200 days per year. Sea ice covers large portions from November through June. Underwater visibility averages less than 3 meters. Currents regularly exceed 3 knots, fast enough to make precision excavation effectively impossible with current technology. No systematic underwater archaeological survey of the Beringian shelf has ever been completed. The budget required for a single targeted excavation season on the submerged shelf, using remotely operated vehicles, research vessels capable of operating in Bering Sea conditions, and the laboratory infrastructure to process waterlogged ancient DNA, is estimated in the range of 50 to 100 million. No such funding has ever been allocated, which means the most important archaeological landscape in the Western Hemisphere, the place where the ancient Beringians lived for thousands of years, where the White Sands people originated, where the ghost populations branched and diverged, is sitting quietly on the seafloor, perfectly preserved, completely unreachable. The signal nobody can explain. Australasians in the Amazon. In 2015, a team led by geneticist David Reich of Harvard Medical School, one of the most decorated population geneticists alive, whose laboratory had pioneered many of the ancient DNA techniques used on the Upward San River infant, was running comparative genomic analysis on indigenous South American populations as part of a landmark global study. The team included Pontus Skoglund, then a postdoctoral researcher who would later lead his own ancient DNA laboratory at the Francis Crick Institute in London. They were not looking for anything unusual. They were mapping standard population relationships. Then the algorithm returned something that stopped the entire analysis. Certain Amazonian populations, specifically the Surui and Cariñana peoples of Brazil and the Xanay of Bolivia, carried a genetic signal that had absolutely no business being there. A component, a statistical residue embedded in their genomes, related not to Siberia, not to Northeast Asia, not to any population that had ever been proposed as a source for the peopling of the Americas. Related to Australasians, specifically to the indigenous peoples of Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands of the Indian Ocean. Populations separated from the Amazon by roughly 17,000 miles of ocean and continent. Reich and Skoglund published their findings in Nature on July 21, 2015, in a paper titled Genetic Evidence for Two Founding Populations of the Americas. They named the source of this signal Population Y, after Wibaiquera, meaning ancestor. In the Tupi language of Brazil, the numbers were striking. Population Y contributed an estimated asignificant genomic proportion to certain Amazonian groups, enough to be statistically unambiguous, impossible to dismiss as noise or contamination. Skoglund stated in the paper, "The signal is clearly there. It's not an artifact. This ancestry is real." The immediate question was obvious and deeply uncomfortable. How did Australasian ancestry get into the Amazon? 3 possible explanations exist. None of them are comfortable. The first, a completely separate migration into the Americas, earlier than the Beringian dispersal, using a route nobody has identified, carried by a population that crossed the Pacific, or traveled through Southeast Asia and across Berinia before the main founding population arrived. This group then reached South America, contributed ancestry to certain populations, and disappeared as a distinct group. The second, Population Y entered the Americas through Beringia alongside the main founding population, but represented an earlier, distinct wave out of Africa that had already picked up Australasian-related ancestry during its journey through Southeast Asia tens of thousands of years earlier. In this model, they were already genetically distinct before they ever reached Alaska. The third, and most disturbing, Population Y represents a transoceanic contact event. People from Australia or Melanesia somehow crossed the Pacific and reached South America. This explanation is considered least likely by most geneticists, but it has not been formally eliminated. What makes this discovery connect directly to everything above is what Population Y reveals about the founding structure of the Americas, the ancient Beringians at Upward Sun River, proven by genome to be a distinct lineage isolated in Alaska. The White Sands people, physically present in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, with no clear genetic accounting. And now, Population Y, Australasian ancestry embedded in living Amazonian communities, contributed by a source population that left no unmixed descendants anywhere on Earth. 3 separate signals, 3 separate ghost populations, all pointing to the same conclusion. The peopling of the Americas was not one event, not 2 events. It was a complex, multi-layered process involving multiple distinct groups, some of whom contributed to modern populations, and some of whom vanished so completely that only statistical traces remain in other people's DNA. In 2021, a follow-up study led by Tiago Ferreira Mendes and colleagues analyzing ancient Brazilian genomes pushed the Population Y question further. They found the Australasian signal present in ancient individuals dating back over 10,000 years in South America, confirming that population Y was not a recent anomaly, but a deep founding component present from the earliest layers of South American prehistory. Reich himself, in his 2018 book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, wrote with characteristic precision, "The results were profoundly surprising. They showed that the history of Native Americans is more complex than we had imagined, with at least 2 founding populations contributing to their ancestry. At minimum 2, possibly more. Consider what this means when placed alongside everything uncovered in Alaska. Swan Point at 14,000 years. The ancient Beringians isolated for 8,000 years minimum. White Sands footprints at 23,000 years. And now, population Y. A ghost lineage with Australasian ancestry, embedded in living communities in the Amazon rainforest, contributed by people who crossed half the Earth and then ceased to exist as a recognizable group. If this story changed how you see the past, subscribe, like, and join us for the next discovery.